God's house there's room for all. In God's house there's room for all. Every child of light, all precious in God's sight. In God's house there's no room too small. In God's house there's room for all. Room for all who hunger. Room for all who thirst. Room for all to love one who love this first. In God's house, there is room for all. Every tiny grain of sand is a diamond in God's hand. In God's house, there's no room too small. In God's house, there's room for all. In God's church, there is room for all the eyes, arms, and hands, with truth that understands. In God's house, there's no room too small, for God's precious place is for all. Room for all who hunger, room for all who thirst, room for all one is love is first. In God's house there's room for all. Every child of light, we're all precious in God's sight. In God's house there's no room too small, for God's prepared a room for all. In God's house there is room for all.
Thank you, Mark, for the gift of your talent and your love. And now I am really happy to announce that as the second part of our Prosperity series, we have a special guest speaker who is going to honor us by talking about generous living, generous giving, being in generosity. So I would like to present Frank Cetera. Thank you.
Good morning. How does your garden grow? How do your neighbors fare?
Good.
How does your inner self fare? I like this generous living title. I don't think that was part of my email communications back and forth with folks. We had gone over some different thoughts and processes about, what I was going to be talking about and what your principles and such. But this is so very succinct in terms of the world of cooperation, which is one of the specialties of my profession and my personal life, that it fits perfectly. My normal Sunday morning practice is a meditation circle at the First UU Church up past Drumlins on the east side. And there's a reason that I like that is because it offers a complete moment of stillness for myself out of every week. It's kind of been a mantra of mine. I saw your poster up here, Peace, Be Still, and I really felt like I could relax. Tolstoy once wrote this phrase that has always resonated with me, and I've used as sort of a mantra during my life. And the phrase is, it enters the heart in stillness and solitude. And solitude means a lot more more than just being by yourself in a room somewhere, right? And so right now, I feel the solitude that comes of being with other people, just like I feel it when I'm in that meditation circle. So I want to thank you for having me here today. I grew up in a community where we went to church regularly in a Roman Catholic household and congregation. As an adult, I haven't continued a religious practice. One of the things that I'm excited about today is the opportunity to start having this conversation and bridging this idea of cooperation amongst our community and amongst religious and faith congregations as well. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts or your questions or anything. If you feel, rise up and speak and interrupt me, that's perfectly okay. And then just one more final thought of sort of intro here is that the last time that I spoke in front of a faith congregation was when my grandmother passed away as a eulogist. And so I want to take a moment on Memorial Day here to remember Nani and my other ancestors as well. So, cooperation as a concept is often thought to infer weakness by many people in society because we have a strong culture of individualism, right? The idea of survival of the fittest, which was a part of scientific evolution over time, is often misinterpreted as being about individualism, right? The strongest lion wins. But it's actually about communalism and cooperation, right? It's about the strongest and the fittest are those who work together the best and the most successfully. It's not just who's the strongest alpha male in the room, right? And so that is really important for me overall, to listen to the people that I am involved with on a regular basis and engage with on a regular basis, and to make sure that I am understanding their wants and needs so that I can bring forth my offerings to them. And how do we do that in a cooperative society? If we want to talk about cooperation as more than just a concept, but as a practice, okay? Now, cooperative practice as a community, let's say, is very different in some aspects than cooperative business or cooperative enterprise. And I know that one thing, that was communicated to me was, this is very much on the farthest back burner, but maybe someday there will be further conversation about how this congregation can be one of cooperative ownership. Now, I think that probably everybody who is here wants to already feel as if you are a part of a cooperative ownership, right, of this space and of this congregation and of everything that happens here. And I think that's important. If we think back to the beginning of the modern cooperative era, which was following the Industrial Revolution in England, we see a bit of a shift, right, from people who were practicing mutual aid and charity, right, to a large extent. A lot of those were religious-based organizations, to becoming now more self-responsible as a group for their needs with each other. And that became the modern cooperative business movement. Okay, the Rochdale Pioneers, you potentially have heard that name, were formed in 1844 in England. These were a group of cotton weavers, right? Folks who had grown up or come from a legacy of being out in the countryside as farming community, as farmers, as cotton growers, as cotton weavers, that artisan aspect of work that was a reality before the Industrial Revolution started forcing those people into the city and into the factories. And they were at the mercy then of the factory owners and the people in power. And they decided to take some of that power back. These numbers don't mean much, but in that first couple weeks when they were trying to raise capital, and money is reality, right? We had the announcement of the tithing earlier. It's something that must be talked about and must be communicated. I guess pleased to hear that, because I'm talking a little bit about money, and I'm talking a little bit about trade and so forth. Now, this group of weavers raised 28 pounds of starting capital over a couple months. I don't know what that translates in today. But with that 28 pounds, they were able to rent a storefront and get an initial inventory of butter, sugar, flour, oatmeal, and eventually tea and tobacco. And they did that, right, so that they could then sell it to each other as cooperative owners of this enterprise for a better price than they were buying it from the retailers and the company stores. I grew up in a small coal mining patch town in southwest Pennsylvania. I'm a Syracuse transplant as of 2005, but I grew up in a small coal mining patch town of about 400 people that had been connected to one of the many, many coal mines that were in that region. And the old company store building still stands to this day in our small patch. And anytime you go by it, right, I at least have these feelings of what that meant to the people that lived in those situations. And it was interesting for me to learn who your speaker was last week, talking about the garden economy and the shared garden economy. And it just all flows together so well. I'm thinking, oh, geez, there has to be so many stories of how my ancestors and people who lived in the coal mining patches were practicing something similar. But it also allowed me to be raised in a union household. My father was a union member, president of our local for a while. He worked on a coal train. He was a laborer, and then he moved into being a trainman. And it also allowed me to be raised with the first hints of what practical cooperation meant in the business and economic world of our times through my first membership in a credit union. I don't know, they put $2 a month or $20 at Christmas time or something in my credit union account. I didn't really realize, at that young age what a credit union was. But if we fast forward to today here in Syracuse, right, and 40 so years ago, when Cooperative Federal Credit Union, which is the credit union that I'm a member of, and I'm actually board president of that credit union, have been for 10 plus years. It reminds me, though, that the story and how these things can come to be is very similar to way back when the Rochdale group started their efforts together. Because if you know anyone who was around at the beginning of that, of the credit union's inception, you'll hear the story of, we sat around the table and we threw in what cash we had. I want to say it was like $30-some. I don't remember exactly. I should know that number. But they sit around a kitchen table, throwing together what cash they had so that they could form a financial institution that was based upon social justice principles, which no other financial institutions in Syracuse could claim to be acting within at that time. And they acted on those principles with that money that they had put forward. And I think that's a very close relationship to what a congregation such as this aims to do with the money that it collects as well. The values of cooperation and the principles of cooperation have arisen out of those original Rochdale pioneers and what they wrote down on paper as to how they wanted to act and how they wanted to relate to each other. The values being self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. I don't think I'm going to say any more about that because those are pretty straightforward. And that's a vision, a philosophical and a social vision that they have. The other parts, though, the principles, are more about how do you put those values into action, right? And one of the ways that you're going to put those values into action is with participation. I don't know about y'all, but everybody that I know who has a community of sorts around them, in whichever way, struggles with the participation of its members. So we talked about two important things so far, at least I brought up two important things. One, the money aspect, sharing ownership in a sense by putting some of your own hard-earned wealth into an effort. And the second thing being the participation. I live in a house that I bought for $1 back in 2010, and I fixed up and run it as a collective household. It's me and my partner, our dog, and 2 other housemates. It's a old single-family Victorian, 3 bedrooms. We've had up to 7 people at a time living in that house together. That was kind of tight. Now we cap it at 4 to 5, and we're starting to look outside the house at other ways to expand this idea of cooperative living. And when you have a smaller group of people like we have there, it's a little bit easier to manage the participation than it is if you've got a larger group of people. And so I say that because, there's no one-size-fits-all instruction booklet for any of this. There's best principles, there's good principles, there's ways to think in terms of what's needed in this situation and what's possible in this situation. One of the questions that we ask incoming potential housemates on the interview questions is, what special needs do you have? And we kind of we talked about how to phrase this, how to be careful with how we phrase this, because we didn't want it to sound as if we were looking for an excuse not to welcome somebody into our home, right? And we basically settled on, what are your special needs so that we know how we could potentially accommodate them, right? And I think that within cooperation, that's an important part of participation, right? For their need from each according to their ability. And that if you ever think that you're going to be doing the exact same amount of work that somebody else is, you're probably mistaken. And if you're doing more work than somebody else is right now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, whatever the case may be, there's somebody else who's probably going to be doing more work than you are. The other really big aspect of cooperation, as far as the principles go, that I want to talk about is, am I going to get like a 5-minute wave or something whenever? I'm not even paying attention to the clock, so. The other big part of cooperation and the principles of cooperation that I want to talk about is that about cooperation among cooperatives. This is really big in the cooperative world right now, and so my background in cooperation is this. I worked for 15 years as a small business advisor with the SBDC at Onondaga Community College, and I implemented my interest in cooperation into the work that I did there, and did educational workshops and educational writing and presentations for my fellow advisors across New York State and eventually across the country. And eventually I left that position. I moved into a position now where I manage a group, a collaboration, sort of a peer learning group of 30 plus organizations across the country who specialize in employee ownership and conversions to employee ownership. And a big part of no matter who you talk to is P6, Principle 6, okay, cooperation among cooperatives. And I just heard that you're practicing that too, right? You have a cooperating minister, you mentioned. It sounds like they travel from congregation to congregation, which you could think of yourselves as a cooperative, and you're cooperating with those other congregations in that way. Just in the short time that I've been here, I'm seeing these, all of these potential ways of identifying with the cooperative movement, right? As a congregation here and as a faith-based community. So the cooperation that I work with and that I work in is very much a for-profit world, right? That's the same one that the Rochdale pioneers were in at the time when they started things. Like buy and sell for the benefit of somebody else and the benefit of each other, that other one of us. And that's not to say that the cooperative principles are not being applied to other not-for-profit enterprises. And so this is how we can start thinking about how we're going to inch a little bit closer maybe into the realm of, how does a congregation function in that way, or what's the potential for a faith-based entity to really take this to heart and mind. The idea that a not-for-profit, right, if you're thinking in terms of a 501c3, a 501c4, right, the American Red Cross, the Humane Society, the local Chamber of Commerce, think of ownership in that regard. They're not owners of their entities, right? Because those are essentially public entities. They're governed by a board, similarly to, sounds like what you practice here. And they're supposed to act, right, in the common good, for the common good. But that doesn't always translate over into the well-being of the workers or the people who make up a significant portion of the effort that goes into that mission of the non-for-profit. So the concept of worker self-directed not-for-profits has come to the forefront. The idea that workers in a not-for-profit can be also part of the governance and management and communications and accountability to a level that they've not been before. And that we can start to look at how can other entities be formed with cooperative values and with cooperative bylaws and operating agreements. Okay? Because we want to bake cooperation in to the cells of what we're doing, of how we're creating progress towards this vision and this mission. We don't want to just say that we're doing it, or we don't want to just say these are the principles. We want to actually lay it out in a functional way, an instructional way that allows us to know if we're doing it or not. Okay? We try to keep this very minimal in our household. We have one house meeting per month, and we have a few guidelines as far as how much we are supposed to contribute to the household. Cook for everyone once or twice a week, take a rotation, take a turn on the shopping rotation for the house, do the chore that's been assigned to you, spend 2 hours in the garden and landscaping, and communicate about all of that as much as possible. And so that communication and the transparency really underlies everything that we're talking about here, because without the communication and the transparency, it's not a recipe for success. I always ask why. I always ask why. I ask why so many times that I know I've been, particularly in certain workplaces, I have been sort of labeled a black sheep because I always ask why. But when I'm in a cooperative entity or in a self-directed not-for-profit entity, which the organization that I currently work for, Democracy at Work Institute, we are a self-directed not-for-profit entity. I don't feel bad about asking why at all, okay? Because I know that that's baked in, that's an integral part of what we're doing. I'm not going to try to share any negative examples of this. You've probably all experienced them at some point. But the why, to me, is the number one indicator of if a community is functioning well. And the why is enabled by the transparency and the communications principles that you have decided to enact. So, cooperation is not just something that comes on its own. It's not just something that acts according to, some innate sense of responsibility. It has to be guided in some way. It takes strong facilitation and strong facilitators. It takes people who are willing to ask why, but also people who are willing to answer the why. It takes contribution, not just a physical or a mental contribution to the work, but also a financial contribution to the work. Until we reach that Star Trekian post-scarcity world of economics, we're going to have to keep dealing with that. And that's okay, because we have ways to do it. We have ways to successfully navigate that system of economy. We have ways to look at it in a way that is not shaped simply for profit, but is shaped for the common good. And we have ways to instill rights for the individuals who are part of that community. One really relevant example of this in today's world of cooperative economics and cooperative business is the union co-op movement. Somebody will say, oh, you're a co-op, that's great, and your workers must love it. Well, the workers, are they unionized? Well, why do you need a union? You're a cooperative. Well, because a cooperative is looking out for the whole, and we need a representation within that who's looking out for the workers, right? And just like in other situations, the cooperative may be looking out for the whole, but you may need a group that's looking out for the elders, right? You may need a group who's looking out for the women. You may need a group who's looking out for the children. It's not uncommon, and it's very relevant to how we bring together different components of not just our regular lives and our community lives, but the vision that we have for being a cooperative society in the end. And the last thing that I'll end with in terms of generous living is that practice makes perfect. I mean, I don't know if we'll ever get to perfect, right? But It requires practice. It requires practice for each of us. So, if you've never served on a board before, you're going to not know what to expect. You're not going to know how to handle yourself, how to manage yourself. You may be scared straight to, think about even serving on a board. But you've got to practice. You've got to take on maybe a small role on a small board or a small community organization somewhere so you can learn and understand how those entities work. When folks come to me and say, I want to form a worker cooperative, I want to get my people together and we want to create this cooperative, or somebody says to me, oh, how are these workers going to run this business? They're just the laborers. They don't know how to run a business, right? They've never done the governance or the organizing or the management or anything like that. Or somebody comes to me and says, I love the idea of cooperatives. I've never been a member of a cooperative before. How do I learn? Well, you can sit and read Google all night long, right? Or you can join a group and practice. I tell people, go to your local co-op or go to your local credit union or food co-op. Those are probably the two most common types of cooperative entities right now that most people are familiar with or already a member of, right? Who here is a member of a food co-op in Syracuse or around Syracuse? Hands going up. How about a credit union, right? Those are both consumer cooperative models. Those are both entities that are owned by the people who have contributed a financial component as well as a time and a physical and mental effort to it as well. So I say practice, I say ask why, I say bring your thoughts to each other in a transparent and communications-oriented way. And I think if we keep doing all of those things and practicing those things together, we will end up with a roadmap towards more generous living. Thanks, everybody. I think I'm staying afterwards if people have questions and answers, but if anybody has anything to say now, I'd be happy to take it too. Otherwise, I'll see you downstairs, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Frank. Can you hear me with the microphone this way? Okay. That was really, really meaningful, really important. And I think I don't have my notebook of notes. I think I'm lost without that notebook.
Grab mine out of here, and that's yours. Yes.
That's called cooperation. Cooperation is a really important word because somebody can be operating here, somebody else cannot be operating there.